For the main topic today, what we're going to be talking about is the concept of debt. We've mentioned it before that paying interest on debt is not a frugal use of your money because it is your income going straight to a bank. And typically, if we are paying interest, it's because we have a consumer debt. And that consumer debt that we have is basically siphoning off interest and costing us risk in exchange for purchasing something that we otherwise didn't have the money for. The only time for HopeFilled Financial Coaching we're going to say it's okay to be paying interest is going to be on a mortgage. The reason why that is the case is when you have a mortgage, you're building equity. You are paying for your housing in a way that's stable and consistent. It is predictable. It's not going to go up. You know what your mortgage payment is going to be for the lifespan of the mortgage. You also are working towards ownership. When the mortgage is paid off, when you own your home completely paid, you no longer have a huge budget item. You literally free up your biggest wealth building tool. The risk that you take on with a mortgage is the same risk you take on with rent. If you don't pay, you get kicked out. So if you're going to choose between renting, where you don't build the equity for the long term, there are seasons where it's absolutely frugal to rent and advantageous to rent. And you're going to look at the mortgage long term. Well, the mortgage is going to be the way that you're going to end up getting into an appreciating asset. It's the way that you're going to end up paying off your home, and it's the way that you're going to ultimately free up your income. Unfortunately, this costs interest. That's why it's incredibly advantageous to work on paying off your home early. The average millionaire pays off their home in just over 11 years, definitely less than 12. This is why Dave Ramsey recommends that you get no more than a 15-year mortgage, you pay it off, and after that, you don't go into any more debt whatsoever. Now, the flip argument to Dave Ramsey is that there's such a thing as good debt and bad debt. From what I explained with the mortgage, you and I, we could say that a mortgage is a good debt. Beyond the mortgage, though, there are other people in the financial space who say that there are multiple types of good debts that could help you build money faster. One of the major voices behind the idea of good debt and bad debt is Robert Kiyosaki. Robert Kiyosaki is famous for the book Rich Dad, Poor Dad, one of the most popular finance books ever written and still one of the best sellers today. Robert Kiyosaki has a YouTube channel and a series called Millennial Money where he converts the topics from his Rich Dad, Poor Dad book and caters them to the millennial generation. What we're going to do today is listen to a couple of the Millennial Money episodes on the Rich Dad channel off of YouTube, and we're going to see if there's anything beyond a mortgage that could be classified as good debt for you. With that, let's jump right in.
What I say to your questions when people say get out of debt, what comes to your mind?
When people say get out of debt, I think about credit card debt, the student loan debt, all that negative debt that people use for shopping and personal things.
And is your idea of debt good or bad?
I have a very negative idea or connotation towards debt, and that's because that's what we were taught in the school system and the traditional education system, that it's not so great. But because I work here and I have these resources and I've gone to your seminars, I understand that debt.
I'm going to pause there. She just mentioned that she went to Mr. Kiyosaki's seminars. This is a sales pitch that starts all of the millennial money videos that I've seen. And I need to share with you, just straight up, this is the fourth or fifth time I'm recording this thing because I've had a few technical issues to overcome. In that time, I have found that Mr. Kiyosaki has seminars where he teaches you to get into real estate with as little to no money of your own toward the real estate. Part of what he teaches in those seminars, or part of what his company teaches in those seminars, is to leverage yourself heavily with credit card debt, high risk credit card debt, when it comes to not only buying the property, but also maintaining the property, doing repairs, fixing things, just taking care of the general expenses a landlord will encounter. As a part of the seminars, it's been recorded that a script will be handed out to participants to call their credit card companies and ask for a $100,000 credit limit. Shortly thereafter, they try to upsell all the participants on another longer workshop and that workshop costs nearly $50,000 or can. I don't think this is a prudent way to go about financial education, to say the least. At the very worst, it sounds very much so like we're trying to get people to raise their credit card limits so that we can take their debt, put them in a position where they can give us that money, and then run away with it. Anyone who tells you that you can get rich quick through debt and tries to tell you that debt is anything other than additional risk, undue risk to your life, is probably trying to sell you something. If they genuinely knew how to make unlimited amounts of money with no money down real estate, they would be doing that instead of trying to teach you how to do it.
Can be powerful and it can be used in a good way, and it could generate you money.
So for those listening, debt is a four-letter word for most people. There are many people in my position, so-called financial gurus, who say live totally debt-free. And there's other people who say cut up your credit cards. And that's good advice for certain types of people. So you should definitely cut up your credit cards if you don't know, you can't control your spending. You should definitely. But I don't know how people live without credit cards. I don't know how you can check into a hotel, rent a car, or go shopping and go out for dinner, so.
I'm going to pause it there. When he says that you may not be able to rent a car or stay in a hotel or go out for dinner or go shopping with a credit card, that's a myth. You can do all of those things with a debit card. I have no credit cards myself, and I have been able to do all four of those things easily with a debit card. I've rented a car multiple times, and I've never run into an issue.
And the other thing about debt, there's good debt and bad debt. So this is going to be the lesson today, is there's good debt and bad debt. And if you only have bad debt, which I classify student loan debt as bad debt, the main reason it's bad debt is because it's the worst possible type of debt. You see, if I get into trouble as a businessman with debt, I can declare bankruptcy.
What Mr. Kiyosaki is saying here is relatively interesting for our purposes. He says that student loan debt is bad debt. And part of the reason why Mr. Kiyosaki believes that is because it cannot be wiped out through bankruptcy. That's about what he's going to say here. Mr. Kiyosaki believes that bankruptcy is a way to wipe the slate clean, but student loan debt will follow you forever and ever into that. Mr. Kiyosaki has filed for bankruptcy with his businesses at least 3 times because he follows a pattern of getting them leveraged and then leveraged more, all the way as he's building wealth and building the company. But then eventually the collection of debt dominoes and results in a failure of the company. Arguably, that's part of why he's filed bankruptcy so many times. It's interesting that Mr. Kiyosaki says that student loan debt is bad because you can't get rid of it through bankruptcy. I'm pretty sure that if it were true that he couldn't get rid of any of his debt through bankruptcy, his whole sphere of advice would change.
But the trouble with student loan debt, you can't do that. It hangs around your neck for the rest of your life. So if you're a student, you shouldn't take on student loan debt unless you absolutely 100% guaranteed that you will commit to graduating. So have you seen a lot of kids drop out of school?
When he says you have to make a decision as a student to take out debt or not take out debt, part of his advice is that you need to know that you're going to graduate. There are risks outside of your control that may prevent you from graduating if you are going through school. It's possible that you get through your first year to even 3, and you borrow 5 figures of student loan debt every year, and then you don't graduate because of something outside of your power. And because student loans are non-bankruptable, you are still liable for that expense. And without graduating in a marketable degree, you end up in a situation where you may not be able to generate enough income to service that student loan debt.
As far as the subject of debt, there's good debt and bad debt. Again, it goes back to the financial statement. Income, expense, asset, liability.
For those who are listening to the audio only and don't have the video, we do have the video on our YouTube channel. Mr. Kiyosaki has taken a large piece of paper and drawn 2 rectangles, one rectangle up and down on the top of the page. It's bisected horizontally, and a horizontal rectangle below that one that's bisected up and down, resulting in a total of 4 rectangles. He then labeled the top one income, the one below it expenses, and then the left and right rectangles on the bottom of the page, he's labeled asset and liability.
So debt falls in here. So let's say I'm going to buy, everybody says I'm going to buy a house, and everybody says my house is an asset. That's not true. Your house is a liability. I don't care if you have no debt on it or not. A house is a liability.
What's fascinating here is Mr. Kiyosaki and what he's diagrammed and termed the financial statement, income, expense, asset, liability, is that the major components of what you can do with money are missing. 2 major components in particular, giving and saving. The other thing that's fascinating here is he has redefined asset and liability. If you talk to almost any other financial individual, they're going to tell you that an asset adds to your net worth, while a liability is a debt that subtracts from your net worth. So if you wanted to find your net worth, you take everything you own minus everything you owe, that gives you your net worth. When it comes to Mr. Kiyosaki's redefined assets and liabilities, he's going to classify anything and everything that is costing you money as a liability. This sort of shifts the way that you think, and this is what he's well known for. This is why his book was a bestseller, is he's able to change the way you think. Part of the problem with this, though, this redefinition, is it shifts your mindset away from your ability to save and be thinking about saving. Instead, you're thinking about debt and you're thinking about cash flow and how you can leverage yourself in order to generate the most cash flow possible while also digging your net worth into a deeper hole. This is unwise because ultimately, if you continue digging your net worth into a hole, even if it's generating you revenue, you're ultimately going to end up in that domino effect that we've talked about. The domino effect where Mr. Kiyosaki's businesses have had to file for bankruptcy because debt represents risk that you are taking on yourself.
Same as if you have a car. A car is a liability. And the reason for that is, as we talked about earlier, the 6 words that are basics of financial education, financial intelligence: income, expense, asset, liability. And the 2 other words are cash flow. So when you look at the average person, they have a job, money comes in here, they pay for their house, and the money goes to a bank.
It's fascinating. Mr. Kiyosaki has said the average person has all their money going to their mortgage and then out through expense through a bank. That's not necessarily how all of your mortgage payment functions. Some of it is going towards the principal of your home. And as you add more to the principal, as you add more to your equity, you're increasing the value of your asset toward your net worth. And again, it is advantageous to do this as most everyday millionaires have a large majority of their net worth tied up in a paid-for home.
So it's not an asset because the cash is flowing out. So it's a liability. So the definition of liability, does it take money from your pocket? And for an asset, does it put money in your pocket? So when I have a rental property here, it puts money in my pocket. So if I live in the house, it's a liability because even if I have no debt on it, I still have taxes, depreciation, repairs, and upkeep, insurance, and all this. When I rent a property, I've done a good job buying it and structuring it. Every month it sends me money. So I started off when I was 25, I had a little 1-bedroom condo, and it put $25 in my pocket. It was a start. So this was good debt. You say the debt also went out and paid, but it also put $25 in my pocket. So net, I was making money from my little house. So today, my wife and I own 6,500 of them. And every month, 6,500 houses put money in my pocket. My people who live in them love me and all this because they have a place to live. But all of this comes from debt. So we have 100% finance here. It's all debt.
Mr. Kiyosaki claims here that 100% of his 6,500 rental properties, 100% of them are leveraged, that it's all debt. Now, this is something he claims, especially in the seminars, that come across as a little bit pyramid schemey. You really can't do this. You cannot leverage a property 100% without doing some under table dealings in order to get a private investor to give you their money for the down payment. The banks will only let you leverage 70 to 80% of a home if you have owned more than that, especially when it comes to investment properties. When you have an investment property, they don't want you to be doing the zero down real estate thing because it ultimately collapses when you don't have your own net worth in the game. The fact that Mr. Kiyosaki claims to have 100% leverage on his investment properties should give us pause as we consider his additional advice, his definition of asset, and his definition of liability, in addition to this concept that he has with cash flow.
So numerous people my age actually think debt is horrible. And you just showed us a perfect example of cash flow and how debt can generate income. And many entrepreneurs use this formula to make money on a day-to-day basis.
So what most people do is they have student loan debt, SL, and that debt is going out this way. You know, it doesn't put any money in your pocket. You can say, well, I have a job. Well, that's still you working for it. So I don't work for any of this money here. I do this job once, set the deal up. Every year I add more and more and more of it. I'm borrowing money from here. It's coming here and going this way. So the debt is putting money in my pocket, and bad debt is taking money from my pocket. So the problem is, if you're going to use debt, you've got to be much smarter than this person here. You've got to be very, very smart. That's why I took real estate classes when I was 25, and I've never stopped taking real estate classes. Because you buy a piece of real estate and you make a mistake, this turns into a liability. If I get the renter leaves the place, this goes here that fast, and the cash flows that way.
For those listening and not able to see the video, what Mr. Kiyosaki has highlighted here is one of the things that isn't explicitly written on the financial statement that he's sharing. He's shown that the asset that generates income, his example is a rental property. If there's no tenant in the rental property, it goes immediately to his definition of a liability and starts taking money from his pocket. The primary thing that Mr. Kiyosaki does not highlight with the financial statement is the risk that debt imposes. If you have an investment property, or any leveraged investment for that matter, if the income generating asset becomes something that is no longer generating income, you still have to service the debt. There's a risk on that. If you have a rental property, there's going to be a renter in there potentially. And for the time that there is no renter in there, anytime that you have vacancy with that property, you still have to service the loan. If you don't have the income or the savings to service that loan without a renter being in the property, you find yourself in a lot of trouble. This is what happened to Dave Ramsey. When he was young, he got into the idea of churning out homes, flipping them, doing rental properties. He had millions of dollars in his real estate portfolio, but it was incredibly leveraged. The moment that there was a risk from outside of his control, in his case, banks calling his notes because they figured that they had lent this individual, this young guy, too much money, then the whole system collapsed, and he had to unfortunately file for bankruptcy and hit rock bottom. As we move into the next video, I want you to think about risk in a different way. If you had a paid-for home or a paid-for investment property, would you go out and take a loan on it so you could buy another investment property or go and speculate in the stock market? When you think of things from the perspective of you already have the asset paid for, would you go leverage it in order to try to get more income or more cash flow? Your brain starts to register the risk that you're taking on by borrowing against your asset. We're going to jump into the next video now. This one is called How to Convert a Liability into an Asset. It continues the same theme of the last video, but dives a little bit more into Mr. Kiyosaki's definition of a liability in an interesting and unexpected way.
Again, this is, you get a job, and this was my poor dad, go to school, get a job, get your PhD. And so this here is cash flow. So the income comes in, and it goes out this way. First line of expense is tax. So this is a poor person's cash flow pattern.
For those who are just listening, he has the same financial statement drawn again. It's basically wiped clean. He's written job outside of the income box. and drawn a line that goes through the income and straight out expenses. Again, Mr. Kiyosaki is forgetting giving and saving as essential choices, essential options you have for your money. He has then gone and labeled this path for money as being that of a poor person. Most of us have a job. Most of us work for money. Most of us are W-2 employees. Now, when he says that we are quote unquote poor for being W-2 employees and for having an income that we have to pay taxes on and then spending that money, he's basically polarizing the idea of where you are and where he is, trying to highlight that he has the answer of how to not be poor, and also trying to get you to identify as being poor, as opposed to trying to help you find a way to be content with the situation that you have. Financial intelligence is not maximizing cash flow at the expense of risk. Financial intelligence is how to grow in financial peace and contentment with the situation that you're in and where you plan your situation to go. It's about coming to terms with your relationship with money and realizing that there's more value to life than simply generating more and more and more money.
It's not how much money you make. Most people, I don't care if you have a PhD or no school at all, but they can't control the cash flowing out through their expenses.
This is why it's important to have a budget.
And so that's why people like Susie Orman say, cut up your credit cards, live below your means, because you're a spendaholic. So that's a poor person. This is a middle class person's cash flow pattern. And this is where the house comes in. First thing, most kids do when they get the pay raise and all that, they buy themselves a bigger house. Oh, my house is an asset. Now, who tells you that? Your real estate agent, of course.
Yeah.
Right? Because they want to give you this false sense of security while you're getting screwed.
Exactly.
Mr. Kiyosaki laughingly claims here that your real estate agent falsely presents the house that you're buying as an asset, trying to distract you from the fact that they're trying to mess you over. This could not be farther from the truth. When you buy a house, even if you have to put a mortgage on it, you're working toward having a paid-for home. You're working toward having a paid-for asset that adds to your net worth, just like the average everyday millionaire. Saying that you shouldn't own a home, you shouldn't have one of the greatest inflation hedges to your personal portfolio because you have to pay taxes, you have to pay property taxes, is basically like saying you shouldn't have a job because they're going to charge you income tax.
You'll pay, most of your money will go out through taxes.
The idea that most of your money goes out through taxes is ill-informed. When we have the progressive tax system that we do, the lower tax brackets cover a good chunk of income earners. And the standard deduction that you have drops your effective tax rate down to something that would be closer to what you give your church as a tithe, closer to 10% to maybe 15% for the average taxpayer for income tax. It's not most of the money that you generate. It's a lot. I know that taxes are heavy, but we've seen much higher tax rates in the past. And there are other countries overseas that have much higher income tax rates that exceed 50%. We're very blessed in America to have a progressive tax system that isn't near that taxing on the society.
So this is a poor person. Money goes out. There's a lot. We just interviewed some National Football League players who make millions of dollars in their 20s. And most of them are broke in 2 years because they can't control cash flow.
The problem here is not that the NFL player isn't controlling cash flow. It's that while they had such a high-paying job, they weren't investing and saving for their life after their football career. This is, again, something that's missing from Mr. Kiyosaki's financial statement, the ability to save and invest in a way that can help you secure your financial future.
Now, if I could bring up a more horrible subject, is do you think people can be assets or liabilities?
I think they could be both, to be honest.
So for most young people, they fall in love, they get married, they have kids. Is a child an asset or liability?
A child is definitely a liability.
Now, I'm not saying don't have kids, but you got to think, the kid is expensive, and they don't get cheaper. They get more expensive every year. Then they go to college, and then it gets even more expensive. So a human being, and that sounds horrible to all the socialists and communists out there, but the fact is, kids cost money.
Yes, children cost money. I don't know what his deal is with the socialists and the communists out there, but I certainly have a problem with classifying people, especially children, as liabilities in this light by somewhat twisting the definition of liability as something that costs you money. Mr. Kiyosaki is effectively implying the advice that you should not have children because they will cost you money, putting the value of his cash flow, his income, above the value of a potential future child. And I believe personally that human life is beyond worldly value, that you cannot put a price on a son or a daughter. It breaks my heart thinking about it, especially as a new dad with a 1-year-old. I love him to death. I would trade the world for him. I couldn't imagine thinking about not having kids for the sole purpose of wanting to build up more cash flow, exchanging a child for money.
But as an old guy, I want you to think about this. As I get older, as people get older, family members become liabilities. So I have a friend whose mother, thank God she had long-term, I don't know what they call it, but they just canceled it on her. She can go to a old age home, and I think the price is $18,000 a month. So that if, as a young person, as your parents get older, the question is, can I afford to spend $20,000 a month on my mom or my dad's long-term health care?
When it comes to the long-term care of someone who's getting up there in age, after someone turns 60 or 65, it's advantageous to have what Mr. Kiyosaki has forgotten as long-term care insurance, which does help pay for that long-term care in the case that you don't have the savings for it. If you have done a good job building up a nest egg, or your parents have done a good job building up a nest egg to cover the expenses of long-term care over and beyond what long-term care insurance provides, then you shouldn't have to really worry about them. However, not everybody has done a good job building a nest egg. And sadly, there are a good number of Americans who are retiring with almost nothing in savings. But that doesn't mean that mom and dad are your responsibility exclusively. And considering your parents as a liability is, in my opinion, an unhealthy frame of mind for your continued relationship with them, especially if you were to take this to the extreme, if you wanted to try to avoid having any and all social pressure or feeling of responsibility. Mr. Kiyosaki's advice would conclude that you should sever relationship with family and live as more of an isolationist in order to avoid the potential liability. And I don't think that's a healthy way to live. I believe that the relationships that we have with friends and family are to be treasured above anything that money can buy.
For most people with our favorite subject, a 401k is an asset or liability.
From what I've learned from you, it's definitely a liability.
Or an IRA or a pension, because it's all
I beg your pardon.
what's going out this way. There's no guarantee it'll be there.
Having a tax-sheltered retirement account is one of the greatest things that you can do to help take care of yourself and make sure that you yourself do not become a liability, in Mr. Kiyosaki's words, to your family and friends. If you are putting money aside for retirement and investing it in a 401k and a Roth IRA, you are emulating. You are walking in the footsteps of the everyday millionaires who have came before you, who are successfully saving and developing a healthy relationship with money so that they can go out into the world and pursue things that matter more than money. To say that a 401k or an IRA or any retirement account is a quote unquote liability, something that is earning you compound interest, what Einstein called the eighth wonder of the world. Einstein described compound interest as being one of the greatest, if not the greatest force in the universe. Just describing those assets, and I'm going to call them assets, describing them as liabilities where they're no guarantee that they're going to be there. I can't even express at the moment what's going through my mind. Please do not take Mr. Kiyosaki's advice when it comes to retirement investing. You should be saving for retirement. I'm a little too fired up to just keep talking, so I'm going to hit play on the video again and see what happens next.
So this is the basic of financial intelligence, financial literacy, stuff like this. Another thing about people is you have a bad advisor, like a bad financial planner or a crook, or a business partner that's a crook, a wife that's a crook and all that. There could be human liabilities.
Okay, I think I'm going to have to just stop it here after responding to that. Listing advisors, people, experts who are trying to speak into your life. Now, granted, everyone who has their own profession, if you're an insurance agent, you probably have a bias towards insurance as a solution. If you sell financial securities, you probably have a bias toward that being the advice you'd give someone. Beyond that, to list them as crooks giving you bad advice, this is why he probably put the 401k as a liability. He probably put it under liability so that when you have someone who's trying to tell you to save for retirement, someone who's trying to tell you that it's important to invest and leverage the incredible value of time and compound interest, that you're going to look at them and go, no, they're a crook, they're a liability. I will avoid them. And I'm going to pursue investing in zero down real estate and pay all of my money away that I put on a credit card to Mr. Kiyosaki and his seminars. I think that anyone who is trying to pin the 401k as a problem or as a liability like this is simply trying to sell you something for their own gain and ultimately a major disservice to you. I think that's all that I can watch here. And okay, one more thing. He said you could have possibly, in his words, just the sentence before this, a wife who's a crook or a liability. Thinking that your spouse might be a crook or a liability or someone who could come into your life, you fall in love and then end up in a position where they are taking you for everything you have, is just, again, leading you to this conclusion that you have to be an independent isolationist and that you should not work on fostering any human relationship whatsoever. I think this is both an inappropriate and an invalid skew on perception from someone who's trying to be a salesman, for someone who genuinely, in my heart of hearts, I believe is wrong. I'm going to have to collect my thoughts and give you a better conclusion and wrap up next week with another episode of the podcast. Next week, we're going to be talking about the number one most important number for your financial future. Thank you for listening today, and as always, budget bravely and enjoy your hope-filled financial future.